The first speaker of today is Erne Blondeau. He is a PhD student at the Wageningen University. She is going to talk about a very cool experimental setup on peat oxidation and greenhouse gas emissions. So Erne, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Erne Blondeau, and as Kai said, I'm a PhD candidate at Wageningen University in research. And I will tell you and show you some results on greenhouse gas emissions from incubated peat cores under dynamic groundwater conditions. And this project was also the thesis project of Anneke Stam, and the other names here are my supervisors in Wageningen. So I'm aware that you have heard a lot about the situation in the Netherlands, like the soft soil situation here already, but I would like to shortly introduce the relevant details for my topic. So the land area in the Netherlands is 10% of that are organic soils, and you can see there are the purple areas here. And over 60% of these organic soils are used as grasslands, and mainly as dairy grasslands, actually, so to produce for cow grazing and to produce meat and milk. And to accommodate for the machinery and the cows on these soils are drained, as you know by now, which can result to groundwater levels that can be as deep as 90 centimeters below the soil surface in dry summers, and are usually between 30 and 70 centimeters below the soil surface, depending on the area where you are. And these practices result in soil subsidence, as you know, but also in the emission of the greenhouse gases CO2 and nitrous oxide. And it's important to mention that nitrous oxide is a very strong greenhouse gas. One molecule of nitrous oxide would be equivalent to 273 molecules of CO2, depending on the time scale you look on. And well, in the Netherlands in 2020, the emissions of CO2 from organic soils were 5.6 megatons, so in 1 year, and the nitrous oxide emissions came down to 0.6 megatons of nitrous oxide expressed as CO2 equivalents. And the Dutch government has formulated a goal to reduce these emissions with 1 megaton per year by 2030, which will be a challenge, of course. So good luck to the farmers. And these problems are studied in the research program Living on Soft Soils. Also the greenhouse gas emissions, and that is what I focus on in my PhD project. So what are the effects of groundwater levels on peat oxidations and the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from that? Since we're a subsidence conference, I think I will just shortly give an introduction about why are the CO2 and nitrous oxide coming from the soil, from peat soil? So a peat soil is composed of, in a very high percentage of organic matter, so plant materials. And when these soils are drained, oxygen enters the soil is aerated, and so this increases the oxygen availability to the microbial organisms living in the soil, and they would decompose these organic molecules to smaller molecules, to mineral forms of carbon and nitrogen. And carbon would leave the soil as CO2, and nitrogen would be transformed to a mineral form of nitrogen. And this can undergo further transformations, some of which can lead to the loss of nitrous oxide to the soil. And the dominant process in which nitrous oxide is produced is actually denitrification, which occurs under anoxic conditions. And also important, organic matter in peat soil can decompose under anoxic conditions in the first place, result and leave the soil as methane, which is also a strong greenhouse gas. And this is the dominant greenhouse gas under natural wetland conditions where the soil is inundated. And as you can see from this picture, the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from peat oxidation are the result of, well, both anoxic and oxic conditions. So there's this interaction, and the question is, which conditions lead to the highest greenhouse gas emissions? And yeah, what are the processes underlying this? Yeah, okay, so I already mentioned that my project aim is to understand these effects of groundwater levels on the oxidation of Dutch peat soils and the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from it. And today I will focus only on CO2 and methane. No, CO2 and nitrous oxide, N2O. And our hypothesis for this experiment were that the oxidation rate is limited both by oxygen and moisture availability, as you might have understood from the figure earlier. And as for nitrous oxide emissions particularly, we expect that groundwater levels close to the surface where there is where anoxic and oxic conditions interchange each other, their nitrous oxide emissions will be highest. And then we also formulated hypotheses on the effects of the soil profile, because there's different types of peat soil in the Netherlands. And yeah, we expected to find highest oxidation levels where nutrient levels and nitrogen availability is highest in the soil. And we also thought that if there's a clay layer present on top of the peat layer, resulting from river sedimentation, that oxidation rates will be lower since oxygen would be less available in the peat layer. So we have been studying this, amongst others, in an experiment on undisturbed peat columns. And we selected 3 soil types for this experiment from 3 areas in the Netherlands. And these types, the choice of these types was based on the soil composition, but also actually on the fact that they are part of other research programs. So it's nice to add these data to existing data. Zegveld and Vlist are relatively eutrophic, so there's more nitrogen present in those soils than in the Aldeborn soil. And there is a clay layer present on top of the profiles of Aldeborn and Vlist, but not on Zegveld. And from these locations, we sampled large soil cores. They have a length, so the peat part has a length of 105 centimeters and a diameter of 24 centimeters. And what we did, we are interested in the oxidation of the peat itself. So to avoid disturbance of vegetation on these greenhouse gas fluxes, we removed the vegetation in the field already. So they are bare soil. And we took 3 replicates per location. So we sampled them by basically pushing large plexiglass tubes vertically into the soil. And yeah, digging them out. We had some help, which was great. And maybe fun to know is that, yeah, if you would push such a tube into the soil inside would compact. And to prevent this, we sort of created an under pressure in like the air-filled part of the tube using a pump. And that worked quite well, so that was nice. We moved these cores to a climate room, so climate-controlled room, and prepared them for the experiments. The temperature here was 16 degrees throughout. And during the experiments, we imposed 2 drying wetting cycles on each of the cores. They all followed the same pace, so each sample was exposed to the same treatment, or the range of treatments. And the first drying wetting cycle took so what we did was stepwise decreasing the groundwater level in these cores. There was a drainage tube present at the bottom of it, so we basically imposed a pressure head at the bottom, and so that was sort of a proxy for the groundwater level that was imposed in the core. The first drying wetting cycle went down to 100 centimeters below the soil surface, and the second one went down to 160 centimeters below the soil surface, and in between there was actually a short intermediate period, just to give me some rest mainly. And we performed greenhouse gas flux measurements 2 times per groundwater level step, and we did it by using the closed chamber method that you can see here, and using a gas monitor. So here I will start with some results on the CO2 emissions that we measured. So above you can see the CO2 fluxes and against time, and below the groundwater level steps against time. And you can see here, so here's the first drying wetting cycle, and the second one. In the first one, each step took place for 1 week only, and in the second one, each step took place for 2 or 3 weeks. So we took a bit more time for that. And as you can see, in both of these cycles, the CO2 emission resulting from oxidation showed a curve in response to the groundwater steps imposed. Yeah, particularly there was an initial stimulation of respiration that we could see in both of these drying wetting cycles. So at the start of the drying of the soil, and actually in this first cycle, the stimulation or the peak already happens during the 0 centimeter groundwater level step, which is not what you would expect, but yeah, it's probable that they were not really completely saturated actually. And then what I would also like to highlight is the fact that during re-wetting of the soil, both here and here, you can really see a decrease in the CO2 emission in response to raising of the groundwater level. Whereas during the drying of the soil, this curve actually looks quite different. It's not like the mirror image of the wetting curve. In this case, during the second drying wetting cycle, there seemed to be some sort of plateau after the initial CO2 emission peak. And in the first cycle even, we saw it seemed to decrease throughout, after the initial peak, it seemed to decrease throughout the drying and wetting of the soil. And if we look at these processes in this way, so here we have plotted the CO2 emission against the water level that was imposed. And again, we see the points are the mean of the replicates, so the mean CO2 emissions. We see that the relationship between groundwater level and CO2 emission is quite different when you are drying the soil than when you are wetting the soil. And the question here is whether we are looking at the result of hysteresis in the response of the moisture conditions in the soil to the water potential, or whether there are also other factors in play. And so it would be interesting to look at the actual moisture conditions in the soil and to be able to find better relationships between this drying and then this wetting cycle. How would they look? And then actually here's the second drying track and the second wetting track. Yeah, there's also actually, I forgot to mention that, but we saw different CO2 emission rates between the first drying and the second cycle, which might be related to the availability of easily decomposable carbon during the and earlier in time, which might be due to remains from roots and roots exudates, which are more easy to decompose, and so time is also a factor to take into account. And when we look at the nitrous oxide emissions, which are, as you might remember, a much more stronger greenhouse gas, as expected, we saw mostly high peaks during the wettest conditions and lower background emissions or close to zero. And the peaks actually mostly occurred during the 0 centimeter groundwater level step, which might also be due to the fact that the soil was not completely saturated, actually. But this was, can easily be explained by what we kind of expected. And if you would plot it against the emissions against the water level steps, you do not see a difference between a situation where the soil is being dried as opposed to when it's being re-wetted. Oh, actually, one more thing that I would like to stress is that during my measurements, nitrous oxide actually had the biggest contribution to the total greenhouse gas emissions. So, so these peaks that you see here, if we would add up the CO2 equivalents of CO2 and nitrous oxide, the highest emissions are seen at actually the saturation step, so 0 centimeters below the soil surface. And that is due to the nitrous oxide emission peaks. So in conclusion, the CO2 emissions resulting from the peat oxidation did follow the water level treatments, but it was, as you could see, not a linear relationship. And the responses to the groundwater level treatments were really different during the drying moisture track than during the re-wetting moisture track. And the nitrous oxide emissions resulting from the peat oxidations were highest at wet conditions, and actually they were not highest at the most eutrophic soils that we studied. And in further research, I will actually look at the data that I also collected about soil moisture in these soil cores with sensors. And I have field experiments on the effects of fertilizer treatments on nitrous oxide emissions, because these are a very important factor for nitrous oxide emissions. So more about that in the future at the next TISOLS.
So nice, Erna. Are there questions for Erna? Yeah, and yeah, you were first. Oh, yeah. But you're closer.
Maybe a question about the nitrous oxide. You said so the least eutrophic soil had the highest nitrous oxide emission.
Yeah, when I looked at the cumulative emissions over the entire measurement year. Yeah.
Potential explanation for that?
Not really, and so I think basically what we can conclude so far is that really moisture availability is the most limiting condition for nitrous oxide production. So this factor doesn't matter that much, apparently. Yeah.
We have time for one short question. Kim?
Thanks for your presentation, Aaron. It was super interesting. And maybe this question is a bit too soon, really, if I look at your outlook, if you're looking at your outlook. But did you correct for like the difference in drying and wetting in water behavior when comparing the difference in emissions as well? Because there's hysteresis in drying and re-wetting.
Well, this is something that I will explore further, since I have measurements on moisture, volumetric moisture content and matrix potential measured at different depths in these columns. Yeah, so that would be interesting.
Thanks.
To present.
Okay, thanks, Erna. Yeah, we have to go to the next speaker. But sorry, Ramon, we are a little bit. But before we go to the next speaker, I realized that I didn't even introduce myself because I was a bit in a hurry because we Michelle was talking so much.